Good evening and welcome to the Case for Cities. My name is Amy Hunter. I am greeting you from the second story stacks at the Mercantile Library in downtown Cincinnati, Ohio. This is the 8th session of this amazing conversation series. And we are so proud to host it in partnership with UC's School of Planning. A couple housekeeping things. If you're watching tonight, tell us where you're watching from, and if it's morning or afternoon, where you're watching from, tell us that too. If you have a question for any of our panelists, please use the Ask a Question button, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you touch it, it'll pop up. You can type your question in there. You can also up or down vote anyone else's questions. If you have questions about the library, you can visit mercantilelibrary.com or ask me anything. I am really excited about tonight's topic, the Green City. And quite honestly, I'm just going to hand it over to Danilo, who is the director of UC's School of Planning. And he will introduce the rest of our guests. I will be here behind the scenes. If anyone needs anything, let me know, but thanks and have a great conversation.
Thank you, Amy, and hello, everyone. I want to welcome you all back to our conversation series that makes the case for cities. My name is Danilo Palazzo. I'm the director of the School of Planning at the University of Cincinnati, and together with my colleagues at the University of Cincinnati, the Mercantile Library, the Ale Foundation, and the Simpson Center for Urban Future, we want to welcome you. We are all very glad you could join us. Tonight, we will discuss the role and relevance of green spaces in urban areas. A topic like this appears at a first look harmless and on which we can all agree upon. When we think about green spaces, different images come to our mind. We can think about the Birkenhead Park outside Liverpool, the very first public park in England paid by taxpayers. That park inspired Frederick Law Olmsted during his visit to England in 1850 and contributed to the design of Central Park in New York and to several other park systems in the US. We can also think about the unfinished George Kessler 1907 master plan for park system for the city of Cincinnati, or to small neighborhood parks and recreational facility. We can include in this list urban forests as well as parks open to the public, such as the Brooklyn Bridge Park in New York or the Banks here in Cincinnati, that combine the offering of manicured and programmed green spaces with the development of real estate initiatives. Green spaces in the shape of parks, nature preserves, or recreational facilities support urban areas and their inhabitants in providing relaxing sceneries, an escape from the urban chaos, areas to gather, to play, to eat with friends and family, as well with casual acquaintances. Some of these spaces are relevant to sustain the overall urban ecology in offering a home to wild and undomesticated species of flora and fauna. They also have an important role in the reduction of CO2 and in decreasing the heat island effect and climate change effects. So we can say that agree on the importance of green space in our city is easy as a walk in the park, pun intended. But is it for real? What if we add equity and access to the mix of ecological, psychological, aesthetical, healthful, and sociable effects? Or if we add just one word, justice, as in environmental or social justice? In other terms, we should question, first as planners, designers, or as citizens, if green spaces are accessible to everyone, if everyone felt to belong to them, if green spaces are or can become tools for gentrification. We should also examine what's their role in the urban future and in climate and racial crises that require a combination of global, large-scale, and local interventions. Over the next hour and a half, I hope to get some answer to this question from our three guests. Billy Fleming, Wilkes Family Director of the Ian McHarg Center at the Weizmann School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania. Hi, Billy. James Connolly, Assistant Professor at the University of British Columbia's School of Community and Regional Planning and Co-Director of the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability at the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. Hi, James. And Carla Walker, President and CEO of Think Big Strategies, LLC. I have asked each of them to give a 10-15-minute presentation in order to have time to ask questions, which you can do via the Ask a Question button in Crowdcast. It is just down there. I will start with Billy Fleming, and first I would like to introduce him. As I said before, he's the director of the Ian McHarg Center, the School of Design at UPenn. Billy is also a senior fellow with Data for Progress. His fellowship with Data for Progress has focused on the built environment impacts of climate change and resulted in the publication of Low Carbon Public Housing Policy Brief tied to the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, introduced in 2019. In his role at the McHarg Center, Billy is author, editor, or co-editor of several publications. Billy is the lead author of a recently published The 2100 Project, an atlas for the Green New Deal. Billy holds a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture from the University of Arkansas, Master of Community and Regional Planning from the University of Texas, and a Doctorate of City and Regional Planning from the University of Pennsylvania. So Billy, welcome again, and the floor, the screen, Crowdcast is yours.
Thanks so much for having me, Danilo, and it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. I'm gonna do my best kind of auctioneer impersonation and go straight into this and go as fast as I can in 10 to 15 minutes. So my job tonight, I think, is really to do some scene setting for us. So to talk about both, sort of the design professions and cities and how they fit within this larger framework or context of the Green New Deal. And I think sort of the best way for us to begin thinking about that is just to literally look at the text of the Green New Deal as kind of known or kind of introduced to us a couple of years ago now through HR 109. This is the non-binding resolution introduced by Representative Ocasio-Cortez in the House and by Senator Ed Markey in the Senate in February 2019. It's actually about to be reintroduced again next week as part of a larger kind of Green New Deal Earth Week push that they and some others are doing. But when we look at the literal text that's in that document, which is really intended right more as a framework and a way to define an era of policy making rather than to pass a single piece of legislation or a bill. Among many other things that it lists there are basically a punch list for the built environment professions. So we'll talk about all of these, but we'll just flag a few here that are obvious, I think, import to tonight's discussion. So the idea of retrofitting literally every existing building in the country for maximum water and energy efficiency, overhauling the entire U.S. transportation system around decarbonization goals, remediating every hazmat or brownfield site in the U.S. Any one of these could be sort of a generational project, and I think to see them packaged together as part of a singular agenda is quite exciting. And I'm often asked in the center, why work on the Green New Deal and why not another climate plan? And some of your work, something like Project Drawdown, something like the Cap and Trade Bill, Waxman-Markey that came about a few years ago. And the answer to that is complicated, but one of the most obvious is that, at least from my perspective, is that the Green New Deal is wholly unique in the American climate policy experience, and that it's the only plan put forward that even attempts to fuse the sort of technocratic demands for decarbonization with, I think demands for good paying, dignified, safe jobs from blue collar workers, with another set of demands to center frontline communities into at least the investment and hopefully investment and regulatory agenda. Most climate plans that have been put forward in this country do one or maybe two of those. It's the only one really put forward today that even attempts to do all three. For me in the center, this has meant a really compelling opportunity to begin thinking about not just the high level, non-spatial, macroeconomic consequences of what something like a Green New Deal might demand of this country, but also what it might mean to build an entirely new world, to reshape how and where we live along the principles kind of outlined in that document. And this is from a scene from an event we did a couple of years ago, kind of asking those questions. But to really understand, I think, to help us understand why that sort of radical or progressive agenda is appearing in the way that it's appearing today, we have to begin, I think, by looking back at the last kind of moment of mass crisis in this country, or overlapping crises in this country, which was the Great Recession in 2007 to 2009. And I won't belabor this point too much. I'll just say, that with hindsight, I think that the response to those crises is going to be viewed as wildly inadequate. And this book here, Crisis Wasted, is written by one of President Obama's chief economic advisors, Reed Hundt, who was in the room for all of these decisions, and his analysis, I think, has really carried the day in that, noting that stimulus package, ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, was far too small. So an investment put out about $831 billion or so in direct spending, which I think in today's context of COVID response bills seems almost laughably small. We were also told at the time that it would be impossible technically to figure out ways to do rent and mortgage moratoria, the two targeted towards Wall Street and big business. Obviously, we know now that is not true. And the third, which I think this is a bit of terrain that still has to be negotiated or fought for in the upcoming COVID response and then eventual Green New Deal packages, is the idea of automatic stabilizers, or the continued flow of stimulus levels of funding until certain criteria are met, like say 3% unemployment. And Reed wrote this book just a couple of years ago now, but many folks were onto this idea of ARA, or the Obama stimulus, being far too small, far too lacking in ambition at the moment it was being released. And this is coming from Nancy Levinson at Places Journal. Won't belabor it because it's here on the screen for us, but I think is really pointing us towards this idea that that crisis response was not sized anywhere near the scale of the crisis. He and Green New Dealers are kind of asking us to think about what kind of scale a Green New Deal might have to achieve in order to address the overlapping crises that now face our countries, our planet, our cities. And I think to do that well, we have to understand what the New Deal actually was. And it requires puncturing a few myths. One of them being, the New Deal is this really heavy-handed, top-down, federal government set of programs. It had a few of those, but in totality, the New Deal was effectively, as Nancy kind of points out here, a mass transfer of federal funds from federal government to state and local government, where questions about implementation were really left to them. The amount of spending was historic. It's a level we haven't seen in many, many years, but these questions about how those funds were used were mostly left up to state and local government, and were made possible through this set of overlapping crises you kind of see flittering across the screen here. Their own economic crisis, the Great Depression, their own political crisis with the rise of global fascism around the world, and then their own ecological crisis with the Dust Bowl and the forced migration of about 3.5 million people. And if we think about the Green New Deal as also being a sort of stimulus package, something designed in the event of the next crisis, of which capitalism provides no shortage of them, we might think about our own overlapping crises kind of mirroring those of the New Deal at a much larger scale. And I'll say a couple other things about the New Deal just to kind of hold with us in this conversation is that in addition to delivering our first and really only universal program in this country, which is Social Security, it also built 55,000 or so literal built projects around the world, or around the country, in communities large and small that range from things that might seem familiar, like the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Appalachian Regional Trail and the Grand Coulee Dam, to things that are far more everyday, the sanitary sewer systems, public schools, public housing, post offices, courthouses, state parks, the things that stitch together sort of everyday life. And you're looking at this map from the Living New Deal is really only showing us about a third of those projects. But if we even zoom in a little bit on Ohio and a little bit more on the University of Cincinnati, we can find, bits of this kind of submerged history, things that are still in many cases being used and enjoyed and loved today, that were products of the New Deal. So Burnet Woods, Trailside Nature Museum, much of the city's municipal, water system can be traced back to the New Deal's era of public works construction. And I think, this is a piece of history that's worth, I think, spending some more time with now than some of these other more, I think, spectacular projects that are often put at the front of conversations about the kind of work, the kind of projects that a Green New Deal might deliver. So if we think about a Green New Deal as being understood by the buildings, landscapes, and public works and infrastructures that it engenders, then what might those actually be for us if we look back at the New Deal? The TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, is a place that's often sort of pointed to as an exemplar of what's possible, in part because it's a big piece of why the rural South moves from 10 to 97% electrification over the New Deal, over the course of the New Deal, But it's also run by architects and landscape architects. And so it's very intentionally designed to be captivating and act as a spectacle. And actually in the post-war period becomes the second most visited set of public lands in the country right after the National Mall. But like much of the rest of the New Deal, this transfer of federal funds to state and local government for implementation meant that questions about power and political economy were largely avoided. And so around the Norris Dam, which we just saw there, the kind of centerpiece of the TVA, that despite Black residents constituting just over 7% of the population around the dam, they made up just about 2% of the workforce that was hired for it. And that while electrification promised significant improvements in standards of living for some rural Americans, it left the inequities of Jim Crow largely untouched. And this is true. This is the way that the New Deal worked throughout state and local government. And I think for us sitting in the sort of built environment professions, it's important to also just recognize that while the TVA has become kind of a heroic example for some architects and landscape architects, there are many other parts of the New Deal state where designers sort of found employment during this period, in large part because the private side of industry was collapsing and consolidating in the sort of throes of the Great Depression. And so looking here at this map taken from Phoebe Cutler's really excellent book, The Public Landscapes of the New Deal, we can see that actually just for landscape architects, they're spread all across the sort of bureaucracy of FDR's sort of nascent New Deal state. And that we can look to a few of these for perhaps some more interesting, more compelling, more usable histories of what might be possible in the Green New Deal. One of those being the Rural Electrification Administration. And I won't spend a ton of time here. We can get into it in the Q&A if folks want to, but the REA is initially imagined as just a financial instrument. It's a way to entice private utilities to build infrastructure in rural communities that at that time they were not serving really at all. Most of the electricity, actually all of the electrical grid at that point was completely private. So utilities and infrastructure were clustered in dense urban centers where there were easy markets and consumers to serve. And the REA's initial plan was to just basically provide funding for financing for them to build out the rest of the system you see here. And after a year and a half of negotiation in which they could never really produce a plan to build this kind of a network out at anything less than about 3 times what FDR wanted to spend on it, in year 2, FDR just told all the private utility companies, to hell with you, I'm going to do this myself, and funded the REA at about $18 billion or so in adjusted dollars per year to build what would become 380,000 miles of transmission line. This is about 40% of all the transmission line ever built in the history of the country. It's built over this period by the REA in partnership with other government agencies, and stands up a whole series of rural electric co-ops that many of which are still in operation today. And also, I think, just gives us a sense of the kind of scale of what was possible through the REA that was never going to be achievable through the TVA. And I won't spend much time on these other examples. This is the Civil Aeronautics Authority, builds out our municipal airport infrastructure system, does it to the tune of about $1 trillion in adjusted dollars over the course of the New Deal. This is Chicago's Midway, New York's LaGuardia, several others fit into this category. And I think to kind of begin to close this loop of New Deal sort of history and think about what we might take with us into the Green New Deal moment of city building, I think it's important to hold this idea that beneath the sort of cheery language of partnership often lay a bitter truth, that prerogatives of localism and partnership built into the New Deal embedded new forms of racial and gender inequalities, and that political modes typically thought of as antithetical, urban liberalism, or actually in many cases sewer socialism and Sunbelt conservatism, or actually Jim Crow, each took root through partnerships within the New Deal state, and actually many were lengthened and strengthened as a result of it. And so, I think to just wrap us up here, really, or wrap my piece of this up really quickly here, part of the genesis, I'm sure, of this invitation is this piece in Places Journal a couple of years ago, which is really built around a set of questions about how to think about making the design professions more useful to this moment of climate crisis, climate, racial, and economic, and housing crisis, to be a little bit more precise. And at least for us, in the center, that's involved lots of things. One of those has been thinking through some of this work that Danilo mentioned at the beginning, or my introduction, looking at the built environment as kind of a key lever for the rollout of the Green New Deal. So beginning with public housing, going now through public schools, moving sort of next month actually into some public transportation work and infrastructure work, much of which is now resulting in legislation. This is HR 5185 here, the bill that Danilo mentioned. It was introduced in the House last year by Representative Ocasio-Cortez. It's now part of President Biden's stimulus package, at least as proposed. We'll see if it survives. But also to think creatively about how to capture public imagination about the kind of world that a Green New Deal might make possible. So here looking at kind of social housing, clean energy infrastructure, recreational and leisure infrastructure in Appalachia, thinking about a sort of world in which prisons as we know them no longer exist, and what we might do with all of the infrastructure we built to support and power them, and in this case, literally converting them to rural electric co-ops in places across Appalachia. So also thinking about some of the kinds of modes of storytelling that might be needed to help people see themselves and their communities and the kind of world that this kind of program intends to build. So with that, I will stop talking and turn it back to you, Danilo, to keep us moving.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you for actually having reminded us about the New Deal and introducing the Green New Deal. So next, I would like to introduce James Connolly. James, as said before, is an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia and co-director of the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability. His research focuses on making cities greener and more socially just at the same time. His studies have been funded by the European Commission and the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. Prior to his current position, he was an assistant professor of urban policy at Northeastern University in Boston, and he earned his PhD in urban planning at Columbia University. Welcome, James. Can you the floor is yours, or the screen.
Can you hear me now? Great. Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all tonight to play some small role in what I think is a very important conversation about where we go with the question of how we green our cities from here. And I want to thank especially Danilo and Amy for the invitation and for organizing us all tonight. The title of my talk tonight is Green Gentrification and the Post-COVID City. And I want to talk a little bit in just very big general terms about some of the research that the lab that I co-direct has been completing in recent years, and some of the main trends and main findings that we've been coming up with. This will be partial and kind of big picture reporting, but we'll hopefully set the stage for a little bit of conversation that we can have afterwards. So more specifically, I'll very briefly just set the stage, offer a little bit of background on why green gentrification might be an issue for us to consider here. And then I will offer a brief definition and some of the key trends within the topic of green gentrification right now. And then I won't have much time for this, but I'll talk a bit about how we might think about solutions to the problems presented by green gentrification in cities. So to begin, to set a little bit of the stage, we have a long history throughout the world of cities pushing the most vulnerable members of society toward the least healthy environments. So from the slums of early industrial era to neighborhoods that were basically leveled for highway creation in the post-war era, we see that worse health outcomes and reduced opportunities to flourish have been concentrated in neighborhoods where environmental conditions generate dangerous air, water, and soil conditions for residents of those neighborhoods, and thus affects these people's health in the long term. So this is a dynamic that is well known and has been a part of cities for quite some time. And this inequity, this trend of health inequity, lies really at the heart of environmental justice organizing in cities throughout the world. And I would say that in different modes and in different frames, this type of organizing can be found in cities throughout the world. So it has quite frequently led neighborhoods to push for ways of improving their local environment on their own. And often this translates into urban greening. It translates into sort of grassroots, bottom-up types of urban greening. So we see everything from gardens to parks to ecosystem restoration projects to urban farms, all coming from this push to just improve the local environment and improve the health conditions of people living in cities that have historically not had access to healthy environments. And we see that this history from cities is visible and is translated onto the effects that we're able to record from COVID, from the COVID pandemic thus far. where, for example, it seems that air pollution is highly correlated with negative mortality rates in COVID, and that exactly this type of air pollution is highly concentrated in certain areas of cities due to industrial contaminants and due to land use patterns that have historically concentrated certain populations in high air pollution areas of cities. We also see that Black and Indigenous populations have higher death rates as a result of COVID, and that this reflects a long history of exposure to poor environmental conditions in cities. So it seems really that COVID only intensifies the need to pay attention to some of the inequities, the health inequities especially, that are produced from the way that we build our cities. Stated as a question, the challenge might be stated as, how can we make cities socially just, ensure health equity, and seek environmental sustainability all at the same time? How can we make these things happen, not as a series of trade-offs against one another, but rather as one goal, one shared goal for cities? And this question and this goal is really at the heart of the research lab that I co-direct and have done so for a few years now. I was very thankfully invited to join the founder of the lab, who's Isabel Angelovsky, in helping to develop the lab. And we've been working very much on these types of questions for the last few years. And our focus has been on understanding the ways in which spatial processes that produce health inequities at the same time fuel environmental degradation by continually reproducing within space the types of inequities that we've seen in the past. So how do the prior environmental justice inequities get reproduced as we keep trying to interact in cities? Those are really the questions that we're most interested in, and that is what turned our attention toward the issue of green gentrification. So Sarah Dooling formally defined green gentrification in 2009 as the implementation of an environmental planning agenda related to public green spaces that leads to the displacement or exclusion of the most economically vulnerable population while espousing an environmental ethic. So in other words, it is when urban greening gets linked with processes of gentrification. And based upon the research that we've been working on, I would say that there are maybe three large categories of ways in which greening might become embedded in or integrated with processes of gentrification in cities that ultimately may displace vulnerable populations. One way in which this happens is linked to the economy, wherein new green amenities basically increase property values in cities. And I'll show us an example from New York City that demonstrates this process of greening becoming linked with processes of gentrification. Another way that this happens is through culture. And this is a process where new green amenities essentially serve a more middle-class lifestyle and may be a part of a process of erasure of other cultures that have been embedded in places for a long time. And I'll look to the city of Barcelona as an example of this way that greening becomes linked to processes of gentrification. And then finally is ways that greening interacts with place. And here, new green amenities reproduce pre-existing patterns of environmental injustice. So how might the introduction of new green amenities simply exacerbate existing patterns? And here I'll look to the city of San Francisco, but also to a more cross-city comparison from the research that we've done. One point to make up front is that what we'll see in all of these is that the argument here is not that greening always is linked to gentrification, but rather there are these processes that may bring these two things together. And so that's the trend I really want to highlight here. So to speak first of economy, probably the poster child for green gentrification is the High Line in New York City as pictured here. And this is a very clear example of greening being part of the process of driving up property values. And the building you're looking at here, this is a rendering, but the building as built, the apartments sold for as much as $50 million and up. And it was very much marketed as a building that was adjacent to the High Line, and the High Line was its main amenity. And this is even the founders of the High Line have admitted that this was a sort of, in their minds, an unintended consequence that just was all out of scale with what they even imagined would happen. But in a study we did of New York City more widely, we see that it's not just the High Line, it's not just these big, high-profile greening projects, but rather greening more broadly that is connected to a process of increased property values. So what we see in this map here is the darker areas are areas that had more greening of any type, whether it be parks or gardens or trees or any type of publicly paid for greening in the city. And the hash marked areas are areas that gentrified since 1990 in New York City. What we find is that there is a correlation between these two things, but also especially that where that correlation is strongest, where greening and gentrification are the most linked, we had incredible property value increases in New York City. That's especially the case in Brooklyn. So greening can at times drive up property values, sometimes to a very extreme extent, and we see that in New York City. But as well, greening can also be linked to a process of cultural erasure. And this is a process where greening starts to express perhaps a middle class or higher set of cultural preferences that were not a part of the place before it got there. So we're looking here at the Poblenou neighborhood of Barcelona, and this is the Diagonal Mar Park, which is a fairly newish park. It was built in the 1990s or late 1990s. And Diagonal Mar is a park that anchors sort of a luxury housing development in the Poblenou neighborhood. And Poblenou used to be a kind of working class industrial part of the city, but as you can see, it's right near the Mediterranean. It's near what is new since the 1990s, a set of recreational beachfronts that were built by the city. And then it's also now the home of a massive redevelopment effort to try to attract high technology economy and also to build more luxury developments in the city. And the Diagonal Mar Park was very much an expression of this transition, this effort to bring a different type of cultural expression to the area. And so greening, especially this park, became very representative of that transition, especially for former working class residents in the Poblenou neighborhood. And what we found when we looked at the issue of parks and gentrification in Barcelona more broadly, as this map shows, is that some parks, there were 18 new parks added to Barcelona since 1990, and some of those parks were highly connected to gentrification and some were not. And it was very much the Diagonal Mar kind of parks, the parks that were about a new type of cultural expression of the city of Barcelona. They were linked to this idea of Barcelona being a kind of global tourism destination and really attracting that type of culture to the city. Those types of parks were very much parks that we would attach with being anchors to gentrification in the area, so being sort of green gentrification parks. Meanwhile, there were a number of parks that are shown in white buffers on this map that did not really attract processes of gentrification, and they had a very different set of cultural norms being expressed through the greening that was done there. And one way that we used to understand how the cultural processes were playing out on the ground was we looked at social media that was posted from within each of these 18 parks that have been built in Barcelona, and asked how were people understanding these green spaces. And to very briefly report out, what we found is that the parks that were associated with gentrification, shown in blue on this table, in those parks, there was a significantly higher tendency to post photos that expressed an aesthetic value or a recreation value for green spaces. And then in parks that were not associated with gentrification, there was a significantly higher tendency to post photos associated with cultural identity or socialization within green spaces. So we have very different cultural and social processes going on in these spaces, and that's part of what greening has the ability to interact with and part of the green gentrification process. And then finally, there's the question of how green spaces shape place. And here we are looking at a rendering of the Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood area of San Francisco. This is a rendering because this is actually the planned redevelopment of Bayview Hunters Point. And if you are familiar with San Francisco, you know that it doesn't look quite like this right now. This is actually quite a massive development plan for that area. Bayview Hunters Point is a classic environmental justice neighborhood in the sense that it has been exposed for many decades to industrial contaminants of all sorts. And it has essentially been the concentrated area of San Francisco with lower income people of color being housed directly next to very noxious and contaminating facilities. And for decades, there has been organizing within this neighborhood seeking to improve the local environment, seeking to bring new green amenities, seeking to clean up the contaminants that are in the area. And for decades, for lack of a better term, it fell on deaf ears. But now there's quite a bit of expected change coming, and much of it is coming on the heels of massive new greening initiatives in the area. So all of these sort of bright lime green areas don't exist right now, but they're planned massive new parks for the waterfront of Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco, along with a lot of new luxury housing developments. And from the point of view of, I did a field work here, and I interviewed quite a lot of people that have organized in this area. And from the point of view of the organizers in this area, this is essentially a trade-off wherein all of the things that might in fact reduce the health inequities, might in fact help them to have a better quality of life and a better local environment, are at risk of being lost by them because they're at extreme risk of being displaced from their neighborhood. So essentially what they're saying is that this greening is really just associated with the process of removal of those populations rather than assisting them or rather than giving them the actual benefits. In fact, they will lose out on those benefits from their view, wherein they are highly vulnerable to displacement as a result of this new development. So thus many residents see the cost of greening as displacement from their neighborhoods and feel as though the benefits will only go to higher income gentrifiers. And this trend in San Francisco plays out quantitatively as well when we look at a number of different cities. We looked at 30 different cities across North America and Europe at the relationship between greening and gentrification. And what we find is that there are particular areas of greening that get linked with gentrification, and that this very much depends upon the growth trajectory of the city. So it's not that all greening causes gentrification, rather it's that there are periods and conditions around which greening gets linked to this process for a number of cities. So we might then very briefly just ask, what do we do about this? What policy and planning responses can address green gentrification? And our lab has just put out kind of a toolkit meant to address that question. And what it does is it gathers the anti-displacement and anti-gentrification tools, as well as the equitable green development tools from 40 different cities. And it starts to talk about how these cities are implementing these tools, what types of mixes are working or not. And in the end, we make the argument that it's all about localities, local governments finding the right mix of anti-displacement and equitable green development tools working in unison. But this looks different depending upon different city trajectories. And so this idea resonates very much with the notion that Billy raised about the Green New Deal, about it being a process of translating it down onto the local context, which has a lot of interesting issues associated with it, perhaps we can discuss. But for example, in Washington, D.C., they're implementing the 11th Street Bridge with a mix of these types of tools that works in Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, Vienna has a very different history of social housing provision and commitment to environmental conditions that leads to something very different in Vienna. But the two cities are doing essentially the same thing. They're mixing these tools up in the way that works for them. And so we provide in that report some ways that cities can start to think uniquely about what works for their locality. And with that, I will leave it with this final point that achieving equity in urban health and reducing health inequalities requires a more complex approach than simply claiming that urban greening contributes to better health, livability, or climate resilience. You can't just leave it as green is good and that's the whole story, because it's not the whole story for everybody. So we need to really include the whole story when it comes to urban greening. And I would argue that this is only more intensified given the trends that we've seen from COVID into questions about the post-COVID city. And with that, I thank you very much, and I look forward to our question and answer.
Thank you, James, and thank you actually to brought us to different places in Europe, Vienna, Barcelona, and New York and San Francisco. So actually we travel tonight with your images, and also in understanding that these issues are not just in American cities, but also in other cities in Europe and all over the world. And so some problems are similar, and also some solutions are or might be shared and become a solution for other cities. Next, I would like you to introduce Carla Walker. She's a president and CEO of Think Big Services LLC. Think Big, Follow Through is the mantra Carla Walker lives by. She has spearheaded large-scale civic engagement and public service initiatives at the local, state, national, and international levels for more than 15 years. Her career spans nearly 20 years in the field of government relations, communication, political strategy, stakeholder engagement, and project management. Most notable is her work on creating the U.S. community engagement and advocacy operation for One.org, the nonprofit co-founded by global advocate and entertainer Bono. She's a veteran political strategist. She has advised 3 mayors, a caucus of 12 state senators. She held leadership positions in 3 U.S. presidential campaigns and has led or advised principals on more than 100 advocacy and candidate campaigns. Carla Walker is the City of Cincinnati Climate Advisor at Natural Resource Defense Council, and she will talk about this local climate advisory role that she's having right now in Cincinnati. Thank you, Carla, and the screen is yours.
Awesome. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. Can you see that? Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Danny, for the invitation to participate in this incredible in-depth conversation. Thanks, Amy, for organizing us. So far, it's been a really inspiring conversation and presentation. The question posed in the preview, can a city be green and just, is an automatic yes for me. I think I'm hardwired that way to believe that at the local level, we are uniquely positioned to create communities and then by extension cities where we can adopt green approaches, but also balance environmental and social justice. And I think that really comes from the career experience I've had from being at the right-hand side of 3 mayors working in the trenches doing this work. So I want to add some local flavor to tonight's conversation and share a bit about Cincinnati's green and just journey from my perspective as an advocate working in this space. When Mayor Mallory began to focus on climate issues back in 2006, 2007, and at that time I was his chief of staff, he had already had a connection with these issues from his work as a state senator. And he came into the seat of mayor with already Cincinnati working on some of these issues from prior mayors. But when he came in as mayor, he also had the support of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And at that time, then Seattle Mayor Greg Nickels had launched an initiative called the Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. And that was to advance the goals of the Kyoto Protocol through leadership and action at the local level. It's similar to what we have seen happen just recently with, the Paris Climate Accord and with the We Are Still In movement. But with the signing of the Climate Protection Agreement, we got to work on creating a plan that set the stage for Cincinnati. And at the time, was hailed as the first comprehensive plan in the state and actually in the tri-state region on climate change and carbon reduction. And while it was a very large stakeholder engagement process and launched some new initiatives, it also synced up existing projects, coordinated some other programs that were already on the table and some ideas that were already in place to better amplify their reach. And begin to coordinate some efforts, including measures for land use. And natural solutions have always been a part of the Cincinnati plan. It's always been a part of our strategy from the very beginning. The first plan took a look at issues and actions like increasing tree canopy, natural green spaces, adding sustainable urban agriculture to our communities, promoting infill development, redeveloping brownfields, enhancing our trail systems. These were all strategies that we employed when we looked at like what was the plan for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. If you just take a look at our parks, which any Cincinnatian can tell you they're amazing and we're very proud of them, but we continue to be highly ranked nationally among other municipal park systems. Last year, we were ranked number 5 by the Trust for Public Land. Our parks include a phenomenal urban forestry program, and they've been working to bring each residential neighborhood up to a 40% tree canopy coverage. That will obviously help with improving the impacts of air pollution, addressing that urban heat island effect, residential energy demands, and of course, helping with stormwater management. But the Parks Department is not doing this in a silo. In 2018, they gave away over 800 trees to Cincinnati residents. And actually that was an 80% increase in the number of plants that they gave the year before. And our current mayor, Mayor Carrie Lee, has endorsed the 10-minute walk pledge, promising to ensure that everyone in the city has safe, easy access to a quality park within a 10-minute walk from their home by 2050. And if you look at the data here, we're not doing a bad job on that. Of course, we could always do more, but not doing a bad job at all. At one point, the city had a green roof loan program. It was a joint initiative between what was then the city's Office of Environmental Quality, the Metropolitan Sewer District, and the Ohio EPA. And that program provided local property owners with access to low interest loans for green roofs and the accompanying on-ground stormwater controls. What you see here is the installation a few years back for the Taft High School. And at that time, it was one of the largest rooftop vegetation projects. We even did a green roof on City Hall. A lot of people don't know that. Also, the city has had a phenomenal urban agriculture program for several years. And just to give you a sense of how popular it is, last year we received 53 agricultural requests for agricultural gardening and agricultural support across the city for about $152,000 worth of programs and projects. And of course, we can't fund everything, but the city was able to provide a little more than $34,000 for 27 existing urban ag sites, but then also add 12 more new sites to the tune of, supporting them at about $35,000. Whenever I talk about what's happening in the urban ag space and in that sort of greening concept, I have to always lift up, especially here in Cincinnati, I have to always lift up the work that's being done by this young man on the right-hand side of my slide here. This is Dominique Peebles. He's the founder of a group called Brick Gardens. It's a social enterprise specializing in converting vacant buildings into indoor hydroponic growth farms, specifically in vulnerable communities, but most especially in communities of color. One of their latest projects is partnering with St. Aloysius, an integrated system of mental health services and education for children and adolescents here in Southwest Ohio. Together, they're standing up an indoor hydroponic farming education program, and then they will repurpose an outdoor abandoned urban farm that's located on St. Aloysius's main campus in the Bond Hill community here in Cincinnati, and that's one of the predominantly African-American communities. And I take some space and some time to always hold up Dominique because he's an example of the kind of local leadership and especially the young next gen leadership that we have here in Cincinnati, who's really focusing on solving climate problems at the community level with an approach that intentionally addresses issues in vulnerable communities, and he gets just results. Every 5 years, the city updates their climate action plan. And the most recent iteration of that was in 2018. The plan and the approach that we've been taking to the plan should also get credit for evolving over time, right? So the very first plan we did with Mayor Mallory in 2008, when I was his chief of staff, was focused on the reduction of greenhouse gases. And by right, it should have done that because we needed that kind of framework and baseline for the city. The 2013 revision added a layer of climate resiliency. And in 2018, the additional lens of equity became a central part of how that plan was developed. As the facilitator and senior strategist consulting on the project, I supported the city's Office of Environment and Sustainability as they conducted one of the most engaging civic stakeholder processes I've ever been a part of. When we started out that process, we had planned the kickoff for about 100 or so people, and we ended up with somewhere between 350 and 400 folks in a very, very packed room. We held more than 30 different community engagement sessions over 6 months, which generated well over 1,400 ideas and suggestions. The end product was a plan across 8 subject areas, 26 goals, and 80 recommendations. And in the natural systems chapter, they included things like increasing citywide tree canopy coverage to at least a 40% level, or ensuring that all residential neighborhoods have a 30% tree canopy coverage. And right now, the difference of tree coverage varies widely from community to community. We have some places where we have 70% coverage and some places as little as 10%. And I don't think that that is unusual in an urban setting. And it is something that we are working on. And of course, the delta is seen in the divide across lines that are around race and income, which again, I don't think is an unusual phenomena. Recommendations on how to achieve some of the goals in our 2018 Green Cincinnati Plan, especially around the natural systems, include things like increasing access to green space, creating and expanding wetlands, increasing the amount of stormwater holding capacity, and using green infrastructure and natural systems to do that. And these efforts are not being these efforts are being overseen by the city's sustainability coordinator, but he's working with a network of community organizations, local businesses, our corporate community to accomplish all of these goals. It is a collective effort. It's not being done just by the city. However, it is time to start looking at how to develop that next iteration of the plan, right? We're 3 years into the 2018 plan. The city of Cincinnati and the council should probably be looking right now at what that next plan looks like, because it would be adopted and published by the council and published probably in 2023. And so we know that parks and these green assets promote health and improve well-being. They build that social cohesion when communities come together outdoors, and it makes cities more resilient to climate change. New green infrastructure like parks, green roofs, gardens, they can make a neighborhood more desirable. This is simply, restating it from the local perspective, exactly what James was talking about. These are good assets, but they can get used in ways that result in negative consequences for our communities, like higher rents, or spotlighting that area for future development, which could leave long-term or legacy residents displaced, or worse, rejected and unwelcome in their own community. These wonderful assets can create pathways, unfortunately, for green or environmental gentrification if policies, strategies, and approaches are not intentionally designed with an equitable and just lens. So the photos you're seeing here are from the revitalization project and the rebirth of Washington Park in Cincinnati's Over the Rhine neighborhood. And it's actually one of my favorite places in the city. Green lighting the pavement in front of our music hall, which ended up in creating this beautiful community gathering space, which is fantastic to have. But again, as we take on projects like this, we need to take note that before we even begin the planning and the project implementation, it's critical that we engage community partners in that process so we can understand their concerns and then bring those concerns and them to the table when we do our strategic process. And I think this is something that Cincinnati has been learning and is incorporating into the work that they're doing. And I'm incredibly excited about some work that I'm involved in with the team here of folks that are actually doing that. There's a collaborative partnership that's been created between Green Umbrella, which is the Regional Sustainability Alliance here in Cincinnati, the City of Cincinnati Office of Environment and Sustainability, and this dynamic group by the name of Groundwork Ohio River Valley, which is a member of Groundworks USA. They've come together to work in concert with a cohort of residents from the community of Lower Price Hill, and this is what you're seeing here. This is LPH, Lower Price Hill. And I'm going to restate that. This group of organizations is working in concert with a cohort of residents from this community. It's part of something called the Climate Safe Neighborhoods Project, which analyzes the relationship between historical patterns of urban racial segregation and climate risk to inform the development of participatory resilience plans and in at-risk communities. And the project focuses on developing community engagement structures that are inclusive and that center racial equity. It's so incredibly powerful in a way that creates space to listen, learn, and incorporate the voices and lived experiences of people within climate impacted neighborhoods. But it also creates these feedback mechanisms and opportunities to incorporate that information into future plans. And so the group we're working with has already developed a neighborhood resilience statement. They have already conducted community surveys to identify community priorities and some of the risks. In the most recent session we discussed green infrastructure possibilities, where they conducted a mapping exercise to plot out exactly where they wanted more trees, where they wanted community cooling centers, gardens, and other green assets. And it was a collective co-creation of the future they saw, where they could actually see themselves in it. And it goes beyond the connection with green. This group is also looking at where can we have jobs for the residents of Lower Price Hill, and connecting that as well with the conversations and discussions that we're having with greening Lower Price Hill and making it a more healthy community for their residents. Cincinnati is one of several cities workshopping climate solutions at the community level through the Climate Safe Neighborhood Program. I'm incredibly proud of this work. It's something that I know is having a difference and making a difference in the way that the city is looking at its next iteration of the climate strategy that they have been on this journey for the last 15 years. The outcome of the work that we're doing in Lower Price Hill is going to be part of the Lower Price Hill Resiliency Strategy. And this pilot is going to help shape the community engagement process for the next citywide climate strategy. Again, intentionally developing the strategy from the perspective of residents is simply the best way to get a just and yet still green strategy and green plan for our communities. And I'm going to stop sharing so we can move into the conversation.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you to bring us all back to Cincinnati, the city that we call home, or most of us call home. And want to remember the audience that if you have a question, please use the Ask Question tool that is on the bottom of your screen. And also, if you want to react, and I see this is awesome when Carla was talking, reaction, I love to read where are you from and the reaction to what our guests are talking about. And I would like to start with some question on my end before to go to the questions from the audience. And I think that the first is specific for James. And you moved recently from Barcelona to British Columbia, and you studied and taught in US. Starting from your point of view as a citizen for such a long time of different cities, and as an observer and as a scholar in green areas, you have seen and perceived differences in social, cultural, and political settings, and also in terms of environmental justice that were related or are related to green areas, and to the accessibility and the perception that people have of this public space. So I guess that the question is, did you see differences, and you talked about this in your presentation, but did you see differences in these different systems in terms of how these public space are available to all, or how they actually felt for some group of people, these people do not feel welcome in this green areas? So you have a large experiences of different cities in Europe, in US, in Canada. So what would be your gut reaction to all these places that you have visited and lived in?
That's a really interesting prompt. Thank you, Danilo. I have not probably reflected enough on it, but I certainly have been internalizing these differences as I've lived in these different cities. And so my personal experience comes from New York and Boston and Barcelona and Vancouver, all of which are cities very well known for greening initiatives. And it is the case, especially in Barcelona, that I had to learn that there is a kind of a very different starting point that a city might have relative to what the local community understands to be green, what it understands to be sort of welcoming or not welcoming relative to their local culture, and public and green spaces look very different in Barcelona than they do in the other three cities that I've lived in. And for that reason, I think that if I reflect a bit on the spaces that we've studied that are the most associated with processes of gentrification in the cities that we've studied, they are spaces that speak a bigger language than the city is, maybe one way of saying it. They try to, they don't speak in the nuanced understandings of public space that residents of the city sort of understand in a nuanced way. They rather speak a language that's more kind of understandable to a much wider audience, I would say. Is one somewhat vague answer to your question. I think there's a bit of an internationalization of the idea of greening, and that becomes part of the language of very recognizable spaces, very kind of pattern language of green spaces that become associated with processes of gentrification. It's not exactly a clear answer to your question, but I think it's something around what I would reflect on in response.
Yeah, well, thank you for the answer. I wasn't pretending, a straight answer to that. I was just trying to figure out and putting, in my own shoes as a European that moved to United States, and trying to figure out the difference between green spaces and public parks in Europe and here, and the way people use the parks, or if they felt welcome or not in public spaces. And I saw differences related in some way with the migrant population that is very visible and in European cities more than here. And those contrasts between, the use of public spaces among migrants in Europe makes sometimes, contrast and conflicts of uses in European cities. So that is something that I like to emphasize. And I have a question for Billy and Carla. Both of you have talked in your presentation about climate actions or climate change. And I understand that Billy's position is to look at these issues at least at a federal level. And in one paper that he actually presented in his slide, Design for Green Future, he said, leaving the challenge of climate adaptation, I'm quoting, in the hands of a massive private foundation and a handful of city officials has proven ineffective at best and disastrous at worst. I understand that I'm putting you in the spotlight, Billy. That was my intention. And Carla instead has presented a climate action plan, or the part of the green plan of Cincinnati that include actions on emission, energy, waste, transportation, and so on. So therefore, my question is how these two views on the same topic can find a common point. In other words, local urban action, even if dictated by good intention, should be considered ineffective if they are not part of a larger design. And I would start with Billy, and then I will lead to Carla.
Yeah, saving the easy questions for the end of the night. Amazing. This is a great question. And look, I actually don't think these views are opposing. I think, the way the argument I made in that paper and make in other places is mostly, I think, oriented around the half-century-long project in the US, much of Europe, certainly in the UK, of hollowing out the public sector at every level of government, whether we're talking about local, state, county, federal government. I mean, even in 2016 at the federal level, before Donald Trump was elected, most of the bureaucracy is staffed at about 1987 levels, so completely incapable of really fulfilling their basic sort of regulatory mandates. And it's become much, much worse since then. And this is part of why, at the national level, President Biden's agenda has included a ton of money to hire people into civil service in the federal government, because we simply don't have the capacity in-house to perform the basic functions of government at that level. And that makes its way into every level of government. I think, in some ways, cities and states and counties are doing all of the most important work at this moment on climate action, because there's nothing else happening anywhere. I think much of that work is admirable and is going to serve and will have to serve as models for what comes next. But we can't expect cities to be islands off on their own financially and administratively and authoritatively. It's just not that model is not going, it hasn't worked. It's not going to work. And I think as long as we keep leaving the future of our cities, we keep leaving the future of the planet in the hands of market forces, we're going to continue to find places that are treated as sacrifice zones. And this idea of kind of green or ecological gentrification, we're constantly looking for sites to redevelop and then purge people from in order to make way for all kinds of investment vehicles that do not benefit the people who live there. Those are things that play out at the local level, but they're products of national policy. And I think I'm really eager to hear from Carla, but I think the way I would think about this is, the federal government playing a role in providing the money, the authority, the staff time, the in-housing of things that are contracted out to the private sector into municipal government in ways that would allow cities to take on the problems they face at the scale and scope and pace that's necessary to respond to these overlapping crises. And so again, I don't really see these as opposing positions. I see them actually as like fundamentally linked and cannot solve one without solving the other. Things like the Green New Deal have to be implemented through projects at the local level.
Thanks, Danny. It's a big question. Thank you, Billy. I'm really glad to hear you say that cities are where it's at. and that we've got this recording, so I've got it on record. So a couple of things I want to respond to. I completely agree with him in terms of like what's going on with respect to especially local governments and their ability to financially foot the bill for some of this stuff, because we're talking about projects that are immensely expensive if you're really trying to move the dial on some of this work. And, you know, cities differ from state to state. And even within the state of Ohio, you've got the big cities like Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Columbus, right? Their budgets have all taken hits, just like budgets for cities around the country. They've all taken hits. If we didn't recognize anything when we experienced COVID, cities got devastated, right? I mean, Cincinnati was one of the first cities that furloughed their staff because they didn't have the funds. They just didn't have the funds to maintain their services, and they furloughed more than 50% of their staff. Perfect example of that is in the Office of Environment and Sustainability. Everyone except one person was furloughed. So, I mean, that's just an example of what was happening and what is the result of these local governments just not having the funding, right? I can tell you too, from the perspective of smaller municipal governments or smaller townships, that they right now don't have an Office of Environment and Sustainability. They may not even really have anyone who's focused on like coordinating their efforts around development and environmental justice or climate change. They don't have the resources for that. This is one of the reasons why here locally, Green Umbrella has just recently brought on extra staff to focus primarily on reaching out across the Southwest Ohio region to municipalities that are not like Cincinnati, that are smaller townships, cities, and towns that may want to get involved in developing their own climate strategy, but they just don't have the human resources and the capacity to do that. Secondly, I want to talk about this leading alone, right? Like cities taking a stand and doing this on their own. We already know that they're not capable of doing that because of the financial issue, but this is not something, responding to climate change at the local level is not something that a municipality or a government structure can do on its own. It has to partner with other organizations, with other stakeholders, with other community-based entities, with the corporate community. If we're really going to address equitable climate change or equitable environmental justice or move things forward in that space, this cannot be something that is predominantly led by government. If you really break this down to the community level, we can no longer continue to do community engagement in the way that we have done it traditionally, where cities or governments helicopter into, or even specialists helicopter into a community, study that community as if the community experience is of no value, and not listen or respect and incorporate the understandings and the concerns of those community members. It flies in the face of anything that we're talking about with respect to equitable anything. So I love the question because I agree with Billy. I think that these things are not necessarily opposing, but it bears some definite conversation around how do we actually do this in the right way, right? So we're not stuck.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you, Ili. Actually, this allowed me to introduce one question that brings to another level, federal, local, The question by Olivia Edges is, how can an individual feel like what they are doing has an impact on the climate crisis, particularly in regard to environmental justice? So this is another level, even a lower one, in terms of scale. And so what a single individual can do in order to walk the walk, or, talk the talk.
I'd be interested in hearing what Billy and James have to say. I would say from the local perspective, one of the things you can do is, if you are involved in or now engaged in any of these environmental projects, or you want to be involved in any of these environmental projects, the first thing folks should do is just listen. In partnership with these communities where you're working to address excessive flooding, or you're working to address just the urban heat island impact, right? This is something that we experience in the Lower Price Hill community when we're working on the climate safe neighborhoods. It's not for volunteers or for city staffers or for representatives of national organizations to create what that response should be, right? So like, that's one of the most important things that a person can do if you're involved in these things, is to listen, to take the time to actually listen and hear what these communities are actually going through and what they are experiencing. I don't want to share with you that what you will likely hear are things that are not necessarily your traditional environment and climate change crises and issues. If you're working in a community of crisis, you're going to hear things like, I need to have my bus stop in a closer location. I'm concerned and worried about my safety because there might be gunfire at night. These are not traditionally those kinds of environmental issues that you kind of think that you're going to address when you're creating a supportive environmental plan or strategy for these communities, but that's why it's so important to listen. I would say the second thing would be to walk in partnership with these communities. And instead of thinking that you're going to be the person to come in and solve the problem, you have to walk in partnership with those communities.
If I could just add briefly, as part of my research, I get the pleasure of interviewing and speaking with a lot of people who are activists and organizers for whom this very good and important question is very central to them. It's something that really directs a lot of their lives, a lot of what they do with themselves. And in reflecting upon those conversations with those people, I think actually this conversation gives us quite a lot to go on in terms of how a lot of people I've spoken with over the years have viewed this question, how they viewed how their own individual actions impact climate crisis. And I think that what they see themselves doing is, as really having an impact, is very much advocating for, fighting for, voting for, mobilizing for the kinds of larger scale policies that Billy is directing us toward, and engaging with and becoming a part of the local scale initiatives that Carla very much highlights in Cincinnati. And I think it's the people that are doing both of those things that really feel like they as an individual are moving. They're moving the dial in some way. And for me, those are people that I have people that are able to do both of those things. I have extreme admiration for. I think it's a very difficult thing, but it's I think the way you walk away from this feeling like you are impacting the climate crisis with environmental justice in mind.
Yeah, I think these are both exactly right, and I'll just maybe pick up a couple of threads, because I think every bit of good work begins with listening, to Carla's point, and so I think that's such an important thing to kind of hold with you after this. I think this idea of like, what can you do at an individual level is both like really important, and I think sometimes kind of a cul-de-sac or like a loop for us, right? Because I think anything any one of us can do to literally improve the material conditions of anyone else's life is some of the most important work you can do. And it's also in the scale of the crises we're talking about here: pandemic, the climate crisis, white supremacy, state and police violence, like also wholly inadequate, right? Those are systemic problems that require systemic action, but it doesn't negate like the value of doing what you can with whatever time and power you have at your disposal. And so I think about this just to bring it to some of our work. We're thinking about a few years ago where the job I do is actually kind of weird. I sit in a design school, I run a research center, we do a bunch of policy work. Like none of those things really make sense together. But in part, do some of that work because I think, to Carla's point, I've done fieldwork for most of my academic career. I've basically built a research agenda around listening and analysis, and spent time before I came here working in policy and politics in the Obama administration, and left that job with some connection to the kind of professional side of the climate justice movement. So the folks with headquarters in DC and New York and some of those other places where the Green New Deal sort of conversation began to emerge, at least in that kind of a context. And I think benefited immensely from that experience with being able to listen and really understand and work with movement groups throughout my work before that. And that the first sort of items put on the agenda for representatives like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others to put on the floor of Congress was to listen to and take our cues from public housing residents in New York. So this is why the Green New Deal for public housing was the first piece of legislation put forward. It's about, obviously, a national scale investment and sort of regulatory framework, but it's meant to address the material conditions of the 2 million or so people living in the 1.2 million or so units of public housing we have in this country, and to do it in ways that will have to be addressed by individual people working on projects, building and retrofitting units all across the country. And I think that's the kind of work in architecture and landscape architecture that's pretty unsexy. It's retrofitting public housing. You're talking about units full of lead and asbestos and mold and ventilation problems, and doing it as cheaply and well as you can. And trying to do it in ways that live up to kind of the dreams and visions and values of the folks who live in those communities and those units. But it's really hard. And I think part of what, when you ask yourself, what can you do, again, to bring it back to Carla's point about listening, what can you do yourself, tomorrow, next week in this space, in addition to listening, is to just ask to think about as you listen, what you can do in your professional life and your personal life to make yourself useful. Even if those things aren't the kinds of things that often get rewarded in whatever your kind of incentive structure is at the place you work. So it's a great question. I think we all need to spend more time thinking about it.
Thank you all. I have another question from Cora Keeker, former colleague of mine at the School of Planning at Cincinnati, now in Buffalo, but still a friend. And he said, Carla, I totally see your point on the relationship between tree canopies and the socioeconomic profile of neighborhoods. It is very obvious in Buffalo, where I now live. What would you recommend a mid-sized city to do to bring trees to disadvantaged neighborhoods? You're muted, Carla.
There we go. So there are a couple of things. And I mean, again, I'm using this, the experience I have here right now with the work I'm doing in Lower Price Hill. The city of Cincinnati regularly does a tree assessment. So I would imagine that Buffalo already has care of. Should those communities that have lower tree canopy percentages wish to get involved with a tree planting project, again, I know I'm probably going to be a broken record on this, but the very first thing that needs to happen is whoever has the relationship with the community leaders, the conversation needs to start with them. And it needs to be presented in a way that, again, that the community does not feel as if they are being imposed on. So the development of a strategy or a project or a plan with the ultimate goal of increasing that tree canopy in these neighborhoods, you have to spend some time developing those relationships with those communities, so that there's that element of trust building that needs to happen before you can co-create a tree planting project. Again, I'm looking at this from a hyper local level. There are, and I don't know if my two co-guests have experiences or are familiar with projects that have had unintentional consequences with tree projects. The one that I think of that I have shared in other presentations is in the city of Detroit several years ago, where a wonderful program was pulled together, but it was pulled together without any inclusion or involvement of the neighborhood that they wanted to affect. After about a year of the staff going in and kind of asking residents if they wanted free trees, or if they wanted a tree to be planted in their front yard, what they saw was that the data showed that the program was a miserable failure. Less than 50% of the residents wanted free trees, which you would think shouldn't be a difficult or challenging thing to give away. However, the organization that set up the program did not have a relationship with that community. The people that they had, the volunteers that they recruited to go into that community and ask about the free trees, they came from outside of the neighborhood. So you had folks answering their doors and responding to knocks on their doors with, to strangers, telling them about a free product without an awful lot of information. And so it really created some tension around what was going on in that neighborhood. Those kinds of things get telephone treed around the community. And so what ends up happening is not only does the program fail, but you then have this feeling and palpable feeling of distrust from this neighborhood with the with the city or with that organization, and it not only damages the project, but it damages the potential of doing future projects with that community, because they've seen that they're not included in this particular project. I hope that's explaining things a little better. I'll leave it to my co-guests to add in some extra.
I don't have a lot to add. I feel like you really nailed that. I think this is all too common a story in any kind of urban beautification greening program. Is this I think failure to really listen to community desires or needs, the imposition of a particular value set on a place that may or may not even share them, and this cycle of distrust, what's often called planning fatigue, in which people and communities are treated like objects to be studied, and sort of endlessly overpromised and underdelivered.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Another example of the dynamic that Carla described exactly is in San Francisco, where tree planting initiatives have been rejected by communities that are essentially suspicious of the motivations for greening, and because they've seen greening serve different purposes in different parts of the city. And organizations that plant trees have very high success in areas where that trust has already been established for decades, and very, very low success in areas where they don't have that trust.
Well, thank you all for your answer. It's almost 9 o'clock, so this is the time that we have to thank you, all of you, and the audience. And I want to just conclude that saying that it has been an absolute enjoyment to have you with us for the whole evening. Thank you also, viewer at home, for your question and for joining us. We all hope to see you again next month on May 5th, 7:30, when Professor Cora Keeker from the University of Buffalo will discuss justice, urbanism, and anti-urbanism. Be sure to check out all the other interesting conversation that we have going on at the caseforcities.org, just one word. We have added 2 exciting conversations on the City of Art and Culture on June 16 and on the philanthropic city on July 14. In the meantime, I invite you to check out the conversation by the Urban Consulate, which focus on urban issues and opportunities, specifically racial, class, and gender equity. Their next conversation on Black and Asian solidarity will take place on Monday, May 10th at 7 p.m. Check them out through the Mercantile Library on www.urbanconsulate.com. And last but not least, I would like to thank all my colleagues and friends at the University of Cincinnati and Amy from the Mercantile Library for having conducted this in the background and having helped us to navigate in Crowdcast, that now will become our favorite platform for diffusing our ideas. And the Ale Foundation, the Orville Simpson Center for Urban Future for their support. Furthermore, I would like to thank North American Properties and the Western and Southern Foundation for their support of the book that we will come out of this conversation series. And I want to remember James, Carla, and Billy to send me your abstracts as soon as possible. And I want to thank you again, Amy Hunter, for this experience. If you want to see this conversation again, be sure to check out on our website for a recording soon. So thank you all. It has been really a pleasure to meet you and talk with you tonight. So at the next time, see you again. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny.
Thank you. Bye-bye.